Chapter 3 of The Tale of Terror, a study of the Gothic romance by Edith Birkhead. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. Chapter 3 The Novel of Suspense, Mrs. Radcliffe. The enthusiasm which greeted Walpole's enchanted castle and Miss Reeve's carefully manipulated ghost indicated an eager desire for a new type of fiction, in which the known and familiar were superseded by the strange and supernatural. To meet this end, Mrs. Radcliffe suddenly came forward with her attractive store of mysteries, and it was probably her timely appearance that saved the Gothic tale from an early death. The vogue of the novel of terror, though undoubtedly stimulated by German influence, was mainly due to her popularity and success. The writers of the first half of the 19th century abound in references to her works, and she thus still enjoys a shadowy, ghost-like celebrity. Many who have never had the curiosity to explore the labyrinths of the underground passages with which her castles are invariably honeycombed, or who have never shuddered with apprehension before the Black Veil, know of their existence through Northanger Abbey, and have probably also read how Thackeray at school amused himself and his friends by drawing illustrations of Mrs. Radcliffe's novels. Of Mrs. Radcliffe's life, few facts are known, and Christina Rossetti, one of her many admirers, was obliged in 1883 to relinquish the plan of writing her biography because the materials were so scanty. From the memoir prefixed to the posthumous volumes published in 1826 concerning Gaston de Blondeville and various poems, we learn she was born in 1764, the very year in which Walpole issued The Castle of Otranto, and that her maiden name was Anne Ward. In 1787, she married William Radcliffe, an Oxford graduate and a student of law, who became an editor of a weekly newspaper, the English Chronicle. Her life was so secluded that biographers did not hesitate to invent what they could not discover. The legend that she was driven frantic by the horrors that she had conjured up was refuted after her death. It may have been the publication of The Recess by Sophia Lee in 1784 that inspired Mrs. Radcliffe to try her fortune with a historical novel. The Recess is a story of languid interest, circling around the adventures of the twin daughters of Mary Queen of Scots and the Duke of Norfolk. Yet as we meander gently through its mazes, we come across an abbey, quote, of Gothic elegance and magnificence, end quote, a swooning heroine who plays the lute, thunderstorms, banditti, and even an escape in a coffin, items which may well have attracted the notice of Mrs. Radcliffe, whose first novel, The Castles of Athlone and Dunbayne, appeared in 1789. Considered historically, this immature work is full of interest, for, with the notable exception of the supernatural, it contains in embryo nearly all of the elements of Mrs. Radcliffe's future novels. The scene is laid in Scotland, and the period, we are assured, is that of the Dark Ages, but almost at the outset, we are startled rudely from our dreams of the medieval by the statement that, quote, the wrongfully imprisoned earl, when the sweet tranquillity of evening threw the air of tender melancholy over his mind, composed the following sonnet, which having committed to paper, he the next evening dropped upon the terrace, end quote. The sonnet consists of 4 heroic quatrains, somewhat curiously resembling the manner of Grey. From this episode it may be gathered that Mrs. Radcliffe did not aim at, or certainly did not achieve, historical accuracy, but evolved most of her descriptions not from original sources in ancient documents, but from her own inner consciousness. It is only in her last novel, Gaston de Blondeville, that she made use of old chronicles. Within the Scottish castle we meet a heroine with an, quote, expression of pensive melancholy, end quote, and, quote, a smile softly clouded with sorrow, end quote, a noble lord deprived of his rights by a villain, quote, whose life is marked with vice and whose death with the bitterness of remorse, end quote. But these grey and ghostly shadows who flit faintly through our imagination are less prophetic of coming events than the properties with which the castle is endowed, a secret but accidentally discovered panel, a trapdoor, subterranean vaults, an unburied corpse, a suddenly extinguished lamp, and a soft-toned lute. A goodly heritage from the Castle of Otranto. The situations which a villain of Baron Malcolm's type will inevitably create are dimly shadowed forth and involve, ere the close, the hairbreadth rescue of a distressed maiden, the reinstatement of the lord in his rights, and the identification of the long-lost heir by the convenient and time-honoured, quote, strawberry mark, end quote. These promising materials are handled in a childish fashion. The faintly pencilled outlines, the characterless figures, the nerveless structure, give little presage of the boldly effective scenery, the strong delineations, and the dexterously managed plots of the later novels. The gradual steady advance in skill and power is one of the most interesting features of Mrs. Radcliffe's work. Few could have guessed from the slight sketch of Baron Malcolm, a merely slavish copy of the traditional villain, that he was to be the ancestor of such picturesque and romantic creatures as Montoni and Schedoni. This tentative beginning was quickly followed by the more ambitious Sicilian Romance, 1790, in which we are transported to the palace of Ferdinand, 5th Marquis of Mazzini, on the north coast of Sicily. This time the date is fixed officially at 1580. The Marquis has one son and two daughters, the children of his first wife, who has been supplanted by a beautiful but unscrupulous successor. The first wife is reputed dead, but is in reality artfully and maliciously concealed in an uninhabited wing of the abbey. It is her presence which leads to disquieting rumours of the supernatural. Ferdinand, the son, vainly tries to solve the enigma of certain lights which wander elusively about the deserted wing, and finds himself perilously suspended, like David Balfour in Kidnapped, upon a decaying staircase, of which the lower half has broken away. In this hazardous situation, Ferdinand accidentally drops his lamp and is left in total darkness. An hour later, he is rescued by the ladies of the castle, who, alarmed for his long absence, boldly come in search of him with a light. During another tour of exploration, he hears a hollow groan, which, he is told, proceeds from a murdered spirit underground, but which is, eventually, traced to the unhappy Marchioness. These two incidents plainly reveal that Mrs. Radcliffe has now discovered the peculiar vein of mystery towards which she was groping in the castles of Athlin and Dunbayne. From the very first, she explained away her marvels by natural means. If we scan her romances with a coldly critical eye, an almost criminal proceeding, obvious improbabilities start into view. For instance, the oppressed Marchioness, who has not seen her daughter Julia since the age of 2, recognises her without a moment's hesitation at the age of 17, and faints in a transport of joy. It is no small tribute to Mrs. Radcliffe's gifts that we often accept such incidents as these without demur. So unnerved are we by the lurking shadows, the flickering lights, the fluttering tapestry, and the unaccountable groans with which she lowers our vitality, that we tremble and start at the wagging of a straw, and have not the spirit, once we are absorbed into the atmosphere of her romance, to dispute anything she would have us believe. The interest of the Sicilian Romance, which is far greater than that of her first novel, arises entirely out of the situations. There is no gradual unfolding of character and motive. The high-handed Marquis, the jealous Marchioness, the imprisoned wife, the vapid hero, the two virtuous sisters, the leader of the banditti, the respectable, prosy governess, are a set of dolls fitted ingeniously into the framework of the plot. They have more substance than the tenuous shadows that glide through the pages of Mrs. Radcliffe's first story, but they move only as she deftly pulls the strings that set them in motion. In her third novel, The Romance of the Forest, published in 1792, Mrs. Radcliffe makes more attempt to discuss motive and to trace the effect of circumstances on temperament. The opening chapter is so alluring that callous indeed would be the reader who felt no yearning to pluck out the heart of the mystery. Lamotte, a needy adventurer fleeing from justice, takes refuge on a stormy night in a lonely, sinister-looking house. With startling suddenness, a door bursts open, and a ruffian, putting a pistol to Lamotte's breast with one hand and with the other dragging along a beautiful girl, exclaims ferociously, quote, "You are wholly in our power. No assistance can reach you. If you wish to save your life, swear that you will convey this girl where I may never see her more. If you return, within an hour you will die." End quote. The elucidation of this remarkable occurrence is long deferred, for Mrs. Radcliffe appreciates fully the value of suspense in luring on her readers, but our attention is distracted in the meantime by a series of new events. Treasuring the unfinished adventure in the recesses of our memory, we follow the course of the story. When Lamotte decides impulsively to reside in a deserted abbey, not, as he once remarks, in all respects strictly Gothic, but containing a trapdoor and a human skeleton in a chest, we willingly take up our abode there and wait patiently to see what will happen. Our interest is inclined to flag when life at the abbey seems uneventful, but we are, ere long, rewarded by a visit from a stranger, whose approach flings Melmoth into so violent a state of alarm that he vanishes, with remarkable abruptness, beneath a trapdoor. It proves, however, that the intruder is merely Melmoth's son, and the timid Marquis is able to emerge. Meanwhile, Melmoth's wife, suspicious of her husband's morose habits and his secret visits to a Gothic sepulchre, becomes jealous of Adeline, the girl they have befriended. It later transpires that Melmoth has turned highwayman and stores his booty in this secluded spot. The visits are so closely shrouded in obscurity, and we have so exhausted our imagination in picturing dark possibilities, that the simple solution falls disappointingly short of our expectations. The next thrill is produced by the arrival of two strangers, the wicked Marquis and the noble hero, without whom the tale of characters in a novel of terror would scarcely be complete. The emotion Melmoth betrays at the sight of the Marquis is due, we are told eventually, to the fact that Montalt was the victim of his first robbery. Adeline, meanwhile, in a dream, sees a beckoning figure in a dark cloak, a dying man imprisoned in a darkened chamber, a coffin and a bleeding corpse, and hears a voice from the coffin. The disjointed episodes and bewildering incoherence of a nightmare are suggested with admirable skill, and effectually prepare our minds for Adeline's discoveries a few nights later. Passing through a door, concealed by the arras of her bedroom, into a chamber like that she had seen in her sleep, she stumbles over a rusty dagger and finds a roll of mouldering manuscripts. This incident is robbed of its effect for readers of Northanger Abbey by insistent reminiscences of Catherine Morland's discovery of the washing bills. But Adeline, by the uncertain light of a candle, reads with the utmost horror and consternation the harrowing life story of her father, who has been foully done to death by his brother, already known to us as the unprincipled Marquis Montalt. Melmoth weakly aids and abets Montalt's designs against Adeline, and she is soon compelled to take refuge in flight. She is captured and borne away to an elegant villa, whence she escapes only to be overtaken again. Finally, Theodore arrives, as heroes will, in the nick of time, and wounds his rival. Adeline finds a peaceful home in the chateau of Monsieur Laluc, who proves to be Theodore's father. Here the reader awaits impatiently for the final solution of the plot. Once we have been inmates of a Gothic abbey, life in a Swiss chateau, however idyllic, is apt to seem monotonous. In time, Mrs. Radcliffe administers justice. The Marquis takes poison, Melmoth is banished, but reforms, and Adeline, after dutifully burying her father's skeleton in the family vault, becomes mistress of the abbey, but prefers to reside in a chalet on the banks of Lake Geneva. Although the Romance of the Forest is considerably shorter than the later novels, the plot, which is full of ingenious complications, is unfolded in the most leisurely fashion. Mrs. Radcliffe's tantalising delays quicken our curiosity as effectively as the deliberate calm of a raconteur who, with a view to heightening his artistic effect, pauses to light a pipe at the very climax of his story. Suspense is the keynote of the romance. The characters are still subordinate to incident, but Melmoth and his wife claim our interest because they are exhibited in varying moods. Melmoth has his struggles, and like Macbeth is haunted by compunctious visitings of nature. Unlike the thorough-paced villain who glories in his misdeeds, he is worried and harassed, and takes no pleasure in his crimes. Madame Melmoth is not a jealous woman from beginning to end, like the Marchioness in the Sicilian Romance. Her character is moulded to some extent by environment. She changes distinctly in her attitude to Adeline after she has reason to suspect her husband. Mrs. Radcliffe's psychology is neither subtle nor profound, but the fact that psychology is there in the most rudimentary form is a sign of her progress in the art of fiction. Theodore is as insipid as the rest of Mrs. Radcliffe's heroes, who are distinguishable from one another only by their names, and Adeline is perhaps a shade more emotional and passionless than Emily and Eleanor in The Mysteries of Udolpho and the Italian. The lachrymose maiden in the castles of Athlone and Dunbayne, who can assume at need an air of offended dignity, is a preliminary sketch of Julia, Emily and Eleanor in the later novels. Mrs. Radcliffe's heroines resemble nothing more than a composite photograph in which all distinctive traits are merged into an expressionless type. They owe something, no doubt, to Richardson's Clarissa Harlowe, but their feelings are not so minutely analysed. Their ladylike accomplishments vary slightly. In reflective mood, one may lightly throw off a sonnet to the sunset or to the nocturnal gale, while another may seek refuge in her watercolours or her lute. They are all dignified and resolute in the most distressing situations, yet they weep and faint with wearisome frequency. Their health and spirits are as precarious as their easily extinguished candles. Yet these exquisitely sensitive, well-bred heroines alienate our sympathy by their impregnable self-esteem, a disconcerting trait which would certainly have exasperated heroes less perfect and more human than Mrs. Radcliffe's Theodores and Valancourts. Their sorrows never rise to tragic heights because they are only passive sufferers, and the sympathy they would win as pathetic figures is obliterated by their unfailing consciousness of their own rectitude. In describing Adeline, Mrs. Radcliffe attempts an unusually acute analysis. Quote, "For many hours she busied herself upon a piece of work which she had undertaken for Madame Lamotte, but this she did without the least intention of conciliating her favour, but because she felt there was something in thus repaying unkindness, which was suited to her own temper, her sentiments, and her pride. Self-love may be the centre around which human affections move, for whatever motive conduces to self-gratification may be resolved into self-love, yet some of these affections are in their nature so refined that, though we cannot deny their origin, they almost deserve the name of virtue. Of this species was that of Adeline." End quote. It is characteristic of Mrs. Radcliffe's tendency to overlook the obvious in searching for the subtle, that the girl who feels these recondite emotions expresses slight embarrassment when unceremoniously flung on the protection of strangers. Emily in The Mysteries of Udolpho possesses the same protective armour as Adeline. When she is abused by Montoni, quote, "her heart swelled with the consciousness of having deserved praise instead of censure, and was proudly silent." End quote. Or again in the Italian, quote, "Eleanor was more satisfied with herself because she had never for an instant forgotten her dignity so far as to degenerate into the vehemence of passion, or to falter with the weakness of fear." End quote. Her father, Major St. Aubert, on his deathbed, bids Emily beware of priding herself on the gracefulness of sensibility. Fortunately, the heroine is a mere figurehead in The Mysteries of Udolpho. The change of title is significant. The two previous works have been romances, but it is now Mrs. Radcliffe's intention to let herself go further in the direction of wonder and suspense than she had hitherto ventured. She is like Scythrop in Nightmare Abbey, of whom it was said, quote, "He had a strong tendency to love of mystery for its own sake. That is to say, he would employ mystery to serve a purpose, but would first choose his purpose by its capability of mystery." End quote. Yet Mrs. Radcliffe, at the opening of her story, is sparing in her use of supernatural elements. We live by faith, and are drawn forward by the hope of future mystifications. In the first volume, we saunter through idyllic scenes of domestic happiness in the Château Laveur, and wander with Emily and her dying father through the Apennines, with only faint suggestions of excitement to come. The second volume plunges us in media res. The aunt, to whose care Emily is entrusted, has imprudently married a tempestuous tyrant, Montoni, who, to further his own ends, hurries his wife and niece from the gaiety of Venice to the gloom of Udolpho. After a journey fraught with terror amid rugged, towering mountains and through dusky woods, we reach the castle of Udolpho at nightfall. The sombre exterior and the shadow-haunted halls are so ominous that we are prepared for the worst when we enter its portals. The anticipation is half pleasurable, half fearful, as we shudder at the thought of what may befall us within its walls. At every turn something uncanny shakes our overwrought nerves. The sighing of the wind, the echo of distant footsteps, lurking shadows, gliding forms, inexplicable groans, mysterious music, torture the sensitive imagination of Emily, who is mercilessly doomed to sleep in a deserted apartment with a door which, as so often in the novel of terror, bolts only on the outside. More nerve-wracking than the unburied corpse, or even than the ineffable horror concealed behind the black veil, are the imaginary, impalpable terrors that seize on Emily's tender fancy as she crosses the hall on her way to solve the riddle of her aunt's disappearance. Quote, "Emily, deceived by the long shadows of the pillars and by the catching lights between, often stopped, imagining that she saw some person moving in the distant obscurity, and, as she passed these pillars, she feared to turn her eyes towards them, almost expecting to see a figure start from behind their broad shaft." End quote. Torn from the context, this passage no longer congeals us with terror, but in its setting it conveys, in a wonderfully vivid manner, the tricks of a feverish imagination. So exhaustive and exhausting are the mysteries of Udolpho that it was a mistake to introduce another haunted castle, Le Blanc, as an appendix. Mrs. Radcliffe's long-deferred explanations of what is apparently supernatural have often been adversely criticised. Her method varies considerably. Sometimes we are enlightened almost immediately, when the garrulous servant Annette is relating to Emily what she knows of the story of Laurentina, who had once lived in the castle. Both mistress and servant are wrought up to a state of nervous tension. Quote, Emily, whom now had Annette infected with her own terrors, listened attentively, but everything was still, and Annette proceeded. "There, again!" cried Annette suddenly. "I heard it again." "Hush," said Emily, trembling. They listened and continued to sit quite still. Emily heard a slow knocking against the wall. It came repeatedly. Annette then screamed loudly, and the chamber door slowly opened. It was Caterina, come to tell Annette that the lady wanted her. End quote. It is seldom that the rude awakening comes thus more swiftly. More often we are left wondering uneasily and fearfully for a prolonged stretch of time. The extreme limit of human endurance is reached in the episode of the Black Veil. Early in the second volume, Emily, for whom the concealed picture had a fatal fascination, determined to gaze upon it. Quote, Emily passed on with faltering steps, and having paused a moment at the door before she attempted to open it, she then hastily entered the chamber and went towards the picture, which appeared to be enclosed in a frame of uncommon size that hung in a dark part of the room. She paused again, and then, with a timid hand, lifted the veil, but instantly let it fall, perceiving that what it had concealed was no picture, and, before she could leave the chamber, she dropped senseless on the floor. In time, Emily recovers, but the horror of the Black Veil preys on her mind until, near the close of the third volume, Mrs. Radcliffe mercifully consents to tell us not only what Emily thought she had beheld, but what was actually there. Quote, there appeared, instead of the picture she had expected, within the recess of the wall, a human figure of ghastly paleness, stretched at its length, and dressed in the habiliments of the grave. What added to the horror of the spectacle was that the face appeared partly decayed and disfigured by worms, which were visible on the features and hands. Had she dared to look again, her delusion and her fears would have vanished altogether, and she would have perceived that the figure before her was not human, but formed of wax. A member of the house of Udolpho, having committed some offence against the prerogative of the Church, had been condemned to the penance of contemplating, during certain hours of the day, a waxen image made to resemble a human body in the state to which it is reduced after death. He had made it a condition of his will that his descendants should preserve the image. End quote. Mrs. Radcliffe, realising that the secret she had so jealously guarded is of rather an amazing character, asserts that it is, quote, not without example in the records of the fierce severity which monkish superstition has sometimes inflicted on mankind, end quote, that the explanation falls so ludicrously short of our expectations and is so improbable a possibility that Mrs. Radcliffe would have been wise not to defraud Catherine Morland and other readers of the pleasure of guessing aright. Few enjoy being baffled and thwarted in so unexpected a fashion. The skeleton of Signora Laurentina was the least that could have been expected as a reward for a suspense so patently endured. But long ere this disclosure, we have learnt by bitter experience to distrust Mrs. Radcliffe's secrets and to look for ultimate disillusionment. The uncanny voice that ominously echoes Montoni's words is not the cry of a bodiless visitant striving to awaken that blushing, shamefaced spirit that mutinies in a man's bosom, but belongs to an ordinary human being, the prisoner Dupont, who has discovered one of Mrs. Radcliffe's innumerable concealed passages. The bed with a black velvet pall in the haunted chamber contains, not the frightful apparition that flashed upon the inward eye of Emily and of Annette, but a stalwart pirate who shrinks from discovery. The gliding forms which steal furtively along the ramparts and disappear at the end of dark passages become, eventually, like the nun in Charlotte Bronte's Villette, sensible to feeling as to sight. The unearthly music which is heard in the woods at midnight proceeds not from the inhabitants of another sphere, but from a conscience-stricken nun with a lurid past. The corpse, which Emily believes to be that of her aunt, foully done to death by a pitiless husband, is the body of a man killed at a bandit's affray. Here Mrs. Radcliffe seems eager to show that she was not afraid of a corpse, but is careful that it shall not be the corpse which the reader anticipates. She deliberately excites trembling apprehensions in order that she may show how absurd they are. We are befooled that she may enjoy a quietly malicious triumph. The result is that we become wary and cautious. The genuine ghost story, read by Ludovico to revive his fainting spirits when he is keeping vigil in the haunted chamber, is robbed of its effect because we half expect to be disillusioned ere the close. It is far more impressive if read as a separate story apart from its setting. The idea of explaining away what is apparently supernatural may have occurred to Mrs. Radcliffe after reading Schiller's popular romance Der Geisterseher, 1789, in which the elaborately contrived marvels of the Armenian, who was modelled on Cagliostro, are but the feats of a juggler and have a physical cause. But more probably, Mrs. Radcliffe's imagination was held in check by a sensitive conscience, which would not allow her to trade on the credibility of simple-minded readers. It is noteworthy that Mrs. Radcliffe's last work, The Italian, published in 1797, is more skilfully constructed and possesses far greater unity and concentration than The Mysteries of Udolpho. The Inquisition scenes towards the end of the book are unduly prolonged, but the story is coherent and free from digressions. The theme is less fanciful and far-fetched than those of The Romance of the Forest and Udolpho. It seldom strays far beyond the bounds of the probable, nor overstrains our capacity for belief. The motive of the story is the Marchesa de Vivaldi's opposition to her son's marriage on account of Elena's obscure birth. The Marchesa's far-reaching designs are forwarded by the ambitious monk Schedoni, who, for his own ends, undertakes to murder Elena. The Italian abounds in dramatic, haunting scenes. The strangely effective overture, which describes the confessional of the Black Penitents, the meeting of Elena and Schedoni on the lonely shore, the trial in the halls of the Inquisition, are all remarkably vivid. The climax of the story, when Schedoni, about to slay Elena, is arrested in the very act by her beauty and innocence, and then by the glimpse of the portrait, which leads him to believe she is his daughter, is finely conceived and finally executed. Afterwards, Elena proves only to be his niece, but we have had our thrill, and nothing can rob us of it. The Italian depends for its effect on natural terror rather than on supernatural suggestions. The monk who haunts the ruins of Paluzzi, and who reappears in the prison of the Inquisition, speaks and acts like a being from the world of spectres, but in the fullness of time, Mrs. Radcliffe ruthlessly exposes his methods and kills him by slow poison. She never completely explains his behaviour in the halls of the Inquisition, nor accounts satisfactorily for the ferocity of his hatred of Schedoni. We are unintentionally led on false trails. The character of Schedoni is undeniably Mrs. Radcliffe's masterpiece. No one would claim that his character is a subtle study, but in his interviews with the Marchesa, Mrs. Radcliffe reveals unexpected gifts for probing into human motives. He is an imposing figure, theatrical sometimes, but wrought of flesh and blood. In fiction as in life, the villain has always existed, but it was Mrs. Radcliffe who first created the romantic villain, stained with the darkest crimes, yet dignified and impressive withal. Zeluco, in Dr. John Moore's novel of that name, 1789, is a powerful conception, but he has no redeeming features to temper our repulsion with pity. The sinister figures of Mrs. Radcliffe, with passion-lined faces and gleaming eyes, stalk, or, if occasion demand it, glide through all her romances, and as she grows more familiar with the type, her delineations show increased power and vigour. When the villain enters, or shortly afterwards, a descriptive catalogue is displayed, setting forth, in a manner not unlike that of the popular feuilleton of today, the qualities to be expected. And with this, he is let loose into the story to play his part and act up to his reputation. In the Sicilian romance, there is the tyrannical Marquis, who would force an unwelcome marriage on his daughter, and who immures his wife in a remote corner of the castle, visiting her once a week with a scanty pittance of coarse food. In the Romance of the Forest, we find a conventional but thorough villain in Menault, and a half-hearted, poor-spirited villain in La Motte, whose, quote, virtue was such that it could not stand the pressure of occasion. Montoni, the desperate leader of the condottieri in The Mysteries of Udolpho, is endued with so vigorous a vitality that we always rejoice inwardly at his return to the forefront of the story. His abundant energy is refreshing after a long sojourn with his garrulous wife and tearful niece. Quote, He delighted in the energies of the passions. The difficulties and tempests of life, which wreck the happiness of others, roused and strengthened all the powers of his mind and afforded him the highest enjoyment. The fire and keenness of his eye, its proud exultation, its bold fierceness, its sudden watchfulness on occasion, and even slight occasion, had called forth the latent soul she had often observed with emotion, while from the usual expression of his countenance she had always shrunk." Schedoni is undoubtedly allied to this desperado, but his methods are quieter and more subtle. "There was something terrible in his air, something almost superhuman. The cowl, too, as it threw a shade over the livid paleness of his face, increased its severe character and gave an effect to his large, melancholy eye which approached to horror. His physiognomy bore the traces of many passions which seemed to have fixed the features they no longer animated. An habitual gloom and severity prevailed over the deep lines of his countenance, and his eyes were so piercing that they seemed to penetrate at a single glance into the hearts of men, and to read their most secret thoughts. Few persons could endure their scrutiny, or even endure to meet them twice. He could adapt himself to the tempers and passions of persons whom he wished to conciliate, with astonishing facility." The type undoubtedly owes something to Milton's Satan. Like Lucifer, he is proud and ambitious, and like him, he retains traces of his original grandeur. Hints from Shakespeare help to fashion him. Like Cassius, he seldom smiles, and smiles in such a sort, "as if he mocked himself and scorned his spirit, that could be moved to smile at anything." Like King John, "the image of a wicked, heinous fault lives in his eye. That close aspect of his does show the mood of a much troubled breast." By the enormity of his crimes he inspires horror and repulsion, but by his loneliness he appeals for a moment, like the consummate villain Richard III, to our pity. "There is no creature loves me, and if I die no soul will pity me. Nay, wherefore should they, since I myself find myself no pity to myself?" Karl von Moor, the famous hero of Schiller's Die Räuber, 1781, is allied to this desperado. He is thus described in the advertisement of the 1795 edition. "The picture of a great misguided soul, endowed with every gift of excellence, yet lost in spite of all his gifts. Unbridled passions and bad companionship corrupt his heart, urge him on from crime to crime, until at last he stands at the head of a band of murderers, heaps horror upon horror, and plunges from precipice to precipice in the lowest depths of despair. Great and majestic in misfortune, by misfortune reclaimed and led back to the paths of virtue. Such a man you shall pity and hate, abhor yet love in the robber Moor." Among the direct progeny of these grandiose villains are to be included those of Lewis and Maturin, and the heroes of Scott and Byron. We know them by their world-weariness, as well as by their piercing eyes and passion-marked faces, their verre wrinkles Gothic. In the Giaour we are told, "Dark and unearthly is the scowl that glares beneath his dusky cowl. The flash of that dilating eye reveals too much of times gone by, though varying indistinct its hue, oft will his glance the gazer rue." Of the Corsair it is said, "There breathe but few whose mighty aspect might defy the full encounter of his searching eye." Lara is drawn from the same model. "That brow in furrowed lines had fixed at last, and spoke of passions, but of passions past. The pride but not the fire of early days, coldness of mien, and carelessness of praise, a high demeanour and a glance that took their thoughts from others by a single look." The feminine counterpart of these bold impersonations of evil is the tyrannical abbess, who plays a part in The Romance of the Forest and in The Italian, and who was adopted and exaggerated by Lewis, but her crimes are petty and malicious, not daring and ambitious, like the schemes of Montoni and Schedoni. One of Mrs. Radcliffe's contemporaries is said to have suggested that if she wished to transcend the horror of the Inquisition scenes in The Italian, she would have to visit hell itself. Like her own heroines, Mrs. Radcliffe had too elegant and refined an imagination, and too fearful a heart, to undertake so desperate a journey. She would have recoiled with horror from the impious suggestion. In Gaston de Blondeville, written in 1802 but published posthumously, with a memoir by Noon Talfourd, she ventures to make one or two startling innovations. Her hero is no longer a pale, romantic young man of gentle birth, but a stolid, worthy merchant. Here at last she indulges in a substantial spectre, who cannot be explained away as a figment of a disordered imagination, since he seriously alarms not a solitary heroine or a scared lady's maid, but Henry III himself and his assembled barons. Yet apart from this daring escapade, it is timidity, rather than the spirit of valorous enterprise, that is urging Mrs. Radcliffe into new and untried paths. Her happy, courageous disregard for historical accuracy in describing far-off scenes and bygone ages has deserted her. She searches painfully in ancient records, instead of, in her imagination, for medieval atmosphere. Her story is grossly overburdened with elaborate descriptions of customs and ceremonies, and she adds laborious notes, citing passages from learned authorities, such as Leland's Collectiana, Pegg's dissertation on the obsolete office of the Esquire of the King's Body, Sir George Bulk's account of the coronation of Richard III, Mador's History of the Exchequer, etc. We are transported from the 18th century, not actually to medieval England, but to a carefully arranged pageant displaying medieval costumes, tournaments and banquets. The actors speak in antique language to accord with the picturesque background against which they stand. Gaston de Blondeville, which is noteworthy as an early attempt to shadow forth the days of chivalry, has far more colour than Leland's Longsword, 1752, Miss Reeve's Old English Baron, 1777, or Miss Sophie Lee's Recess, 1785, from which, rather than from Mrs. Radcliffe's earlier romances, its descent may be traced. The attempt to avoid glaring anachronisms and to reproduce an accurate picture of a former age points forward to Scott. Strutt's Queenhoo Hall, which Scott completed, was a revolt against the unscrupulous inventions of romance writers and was crammed full of archaeological lore. The story of Gaston de Blondeville is tedious, the characters are shadowy and unreal, and we become, as the Ettrick Shepherd remarked in Noctes Ambrosinae, quote, somewhat too hand in glove with his ghostship. Yet regarded simply as a spectacular effect, it is not without indications of skill and power. Miss Mitford based a drama on it, but it never attained the popularity of Mrs. Radcliffe's other novels. It was published when her reputation was on the wane. Of the materials on which Mrs. Radcliffe drew in fashioning her romances, it is impossible to speak with any certainty. Doubtless she had studied certain old chronicles, and she was deeply read in Shakespeare, especially in the tragedies. Much of her leisure, we are told, was spent in reading the literary productions of the day, especially poetry and novels. At the head of her chapters, she often quotes Milton, as well as the poets of her own century, Mason, Gray, Collins, and once Ossian, choosing almost inevitably passages which deal with the terrible or the ghostly. She must have known the Castle of Otranto, and in the Italian she quotes several passages from Walpole's melodrama, The Mysterious Mother. But often she may have been dependent on the oral legends clustering round ancient abbeys for the background of her stories. Ghostly legends would always appeal to her, and she probably amassed a hoard of traditions when she visited English castles during her tours with her husband. The background of Gaston de Blondeville is Kenilworth Castle. That ancient ruins stirred her imagination profoundly is clear from passages in her notes on the journeys. In Furness Abbey, she sees in her mind's eye, quote, a midnight procession of monks, end quote, and at Brougham Castle, quote, one almost saw the surly keeper descending through this door-case and heard him rattle the keys of the chamber above, listening with indifference to the clank of chains and the echo of that groan below which seemed to rend the heart it burst from. End quote. Or again, quote, slender saplings of ash waved over the deserted door-cases, where, at the transforming hour of twilight, the superstitious eye might mistake them for the spectres of some early possessor of the castle, restless from guilt, or of some sufferer, persevering for vengeance. End quote. Mrs. Radcliffe's style compares favourably with that of many of her contemporaries, with that of Mrs. Roche, for instance, who wrote The Children of the Abbey, and an array of other forgotten romances, but she is too fond of long, imperfectly balanced sentences, with as many awkward twists and turns as the winding stairways of her ancient turrets. Nobody in the novels, except the talkative comic servant, who is meant to be vulgar and ridiculous, ever condescends to use colloquial speech. Even in moments of extreme peril, the heroines are very choice in their diction. Dialogue in Mrs. Radcliffe's world is as stilted and unnatural as that of the prim, old-fashioned schoolbooks. In her earliest novel, she uses very little conversation, clearly finding the indirect form of the narrative easier. Sometimes, in the more highly wrought passages of description, she slips unaware into a more daring phrase. Example, in Adolfo, the track of blood glared upon the stairs, where the word suggests not the actual appearance of the bloodstain, but rather its effect on Emily's inflamed and disordered imagination. Dickens might have chosen the word deliberately in this connection, but he would have used it not once but several times to ensure his result and to emphasise the impression. This is not Mrs. Radcliffe's way. Her attention to style is mainly subconscious, her chief interest being in situation. Her descriptions of scenery have often been praised. Crabbe Robinson declared in his diary that he preferred them to those of Waverley. When Byron visited Venice, he found no better words to describe its beauty than those of Mrs. Radcliffe, who had never seen it. Quote, "I saw from out the wave her structures rise as from the stroke of an enchanted wand." End quote. In 1794, Mrs. Radcliffe and her husband made a journey through Holland and West Germany, of which she wrote an account, including with it observations made during a tour of the English lakes. All her novels, except The Italian and Gaston de Blondeville, had been written before she went abroad, and in describing foreign scenery she relied on her imagination, aided perhaps by pictures and descriptions, as well as by her recollections of English mountains and lakes. The attempt to blend into a single picture a landscape actually seen and a landscape only known at second hand may account perhaps for the lack of distinctness in her pictures. Her descriptions of scenery are elaborate and often prolix, but it is often difficult to form a clear image of the scene. In her novels she cares for landscape only as an effective background, and paints with the broad, careless sweep of a theatrical scene painter. In The Journeys, where she depicts scenery for its own sake, her delineation is far more definite and distinct. She reveals an unusual feeling for colour and for the lights and tones of a changing sea or sky. Quote, "It is most interesting to watch the progress of evening and its effect on the waters. Streaks of light scattered among the dark western clouds after the sun had set, and gleaming in long reflection on the sea, while a grey obscurity was drawing over the east, as the vapours rose gradually from the ocean. The air was breathless, the tall sails of the vessel were without motion, and her course upon the deep scarcely perceptible, while above the planet burned with steady dignity and threw a tremendous line of light upon the sea, whose surface flowed in smooth, waveless expanse. Then other planets appeared, and countless stars spangled the dark waters. Twilight now pervaded air and ocean, but the west was still luminous, where one solemn gleam of dusky red edged the horizon from under heavy vapours." End quote. Sometimes her scenes are disappointingly vague. She describes Ingleborough as rising from elegantly swelling ground, and attempts to convey a stretch of country by enumerating a list of its features in generalised terms. Quote, "Gentle sweeping slopes, rich in verdure, thick enclosures, woods, bowery hop grounds, sheltered mansions announcing the wealth, and substantial farms with neat villages, the comfort of the country." End quote. Yet she notices tiny mosses, whose hues were pea green and primrose, and sometimes reveals flashes of imaginative insight into natural beauty, like the dark sides of mountains marked only by the blue smoke of weeds driven in circles near the ground. These personal, intimate touches of detail are very different from the highly coloured sunrises and sunsets that awaken the raptures of her heroines. With all her limitations, Mrs. Radcliffe is a figure whom it is impossible to ignore in the history of the novel. Her influence was potent on Lewis and on Maturin, as well as on a host of forgotten writers. Scott admired her works and probably owed something in his craftsmanship to his early study of them. She appeals most strongly in youth. The Ettrick shepherd, who was by nature and education, quote, "just excessive superstitious," end quote, declares, quote, "Had I read Adolfo and her other romances in my boyish days, my hair would have stood on end like that of other folk. But afore her volumes fell into my hands, my soul had been fricted by all kinds of traditionary terrors, and many hundred times have I most swart with fear in lonesome spots in muir and woods at midnight, when no living thing was moving but mysel and the great moon." End quote. There are dull stretches in her works, but as Hazlitt justly claims, quote, "in harrowing up the soul of imaginary horrors, and making the flesh creep and the nerves thrill with fond hopes and fears, she is unrivalled by her countrymen." End quote. End of chapter 3. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia.